This episode will rely primarily on the Biblical Archaeology Review magazine called House of the Rising Sun, Azekah's Canaanite Temple by Lipschitz, Rips, Oming, and Kyman. I've included some other material from other sources, but this Biblical Archaeology Review article in their magazine is all over this temple and covering this temple. What was the time and the place of Azekah's temple? The temple is located in Shepla in the Judean foothills on top of the Elah Valley. The place is essentially central Judea, on the border between the hill country leading up to Jerusalem and the coastal plain leading down to the Mediterranean Sea. So to put that into perspective, it's about 36 kilometers from Ashdod on the Mediterranean Sea, walking downhill from 200 meters to sea level, doable, very doable, and a one-day journey, and about the same distance to Ashkelon. Now it was a 43-kilometer walk to Jerusalem, walking uphill about 500 meters. And this would have been up and down through the hill country. So I would say it was at the very least a 2-day journey and not an easy trip to Jerusalem. And location matters. For a time from the mid-16th century BC to the 12th century, the southern Levant and Canaan, including this area around the temple, were ruled by Egypt. This is the late Bronze Age era. This area of Shephelah would be pretty easily connected back to Egypt. It might have taken as little as a few days to get from the Azekah temple to Egypt. This relative closeness connected this temple complex closely to the Egyptian administration, both economically and culturally. Now let's look at the actual location of the temple. It overlooked a valley pointing in the direction of the rising sun. Now let's talk about the actual location of the temple. It overlooked a valley pointed in the direction of the rising sun. Temples pointing to the east is a very old concept, clearly because this temple is very old. Churches to this day are specifically designed to point to the east. The eastward orientation is a concept that spread far and wide in ancient temple design. We talked about the place, now let's talk about the time. The temple was started around the 13th century BC. This was during the time of the New Kingdom of Egypt, which controlled the southern Levant, including Canaan. The Azekah temple started as an open structure, but through a series of renovations was enclosed in a building in the 12th century, which was at the high point of its importance. It also happens that in that same century, the temple was destroyed. The rise and the fall of this temple. The rise in importance of this temple and its collapse and destruction track with the rise and fall of the great empire of the New Kingdom of Egypt. So let's just quickly talk about the New Kingdom of Egypt. This is really peak Egypt, you could say. Some of the top pharaohs that you've heard of, such as Ramesses II, lived during this time. The word pharaoh itself even starts in the New Kingdom. Pharaoh, which is a Greek word based on an Egyptian word, would come into prominence during this time. The term pharaoh would not have been used in Egypt prior to the New Kingdom period. The time period, during this time period, Egypt controlled the Levant, was a really what you could call a high time in human history. There was vast wealth and civilizations far and wide and trade connections to civilizations all over this Eastern Mediterranean area. And the trade networks would even go as far as Britain and into Afghanistan. Goods moved all across the ancient world, and this temple of Azekah was smack dab in the middle. It was the crossroads of several major trade routes. Azekah's temple was tied directly into the Egyptian administration, and it was the location of high-status good productions. Pottery, oils, and perfumes were made in the surrounding city for trade. Then something disastrous happened, and that is the Bronze Age collapse In and around the year 1177, the entire world economy collapsed. And there's many theories for why this collapse happened, but the Bronze Age collapse did in fact happen, and it happened conveniently around the time of the end of Azekah's temple. Scholars try to say that the collapse happened because of one thing or another, the sea peoples, a volcano, or this or that. I think when you look at civilizational and economic collapse, it's generally that there's a lot of problems in the system. And you can see that in the famous 1177, the Bronze Age collapse book. Read other books as well. It's generally that the system has a lot of problems built into it. None of those problems, and even all of those problems in their totality, can collapse the system. But then something called a black swan event happens, and that makes all these fragilities in the system completely bottom out. There's tons of great books you can read on societal collapse and black swan events. In particular, one is called the Black Swan. But moving on from that, in the 12th century, the temple was destroyed. Archaeologists have discovered skeletons of 5 men in the ruins, or in the ruins, you could say, of the temple from ages 15 to 55. 2 were found in the courtyard area, and 3 others were probably on the roof as it fell in. So who were these guys? Were they priests holding out during the siege of the temple? Were they the defenders of the temple? Who was besieging the town? Was it the sea people? Proto-Israelites? Who knows? More archaeology will certainly shed light onto this situation, but you can see in the texts, in the ancient cuneiform texts, in the biblical texts, you can see remnants of this, that this was a cultural memory that was hanging out. I mean, honestly, it was a cultural memory in all of these areas that had been destroyed. We'll move on to the layout of the temple. The temple was originally completely open, basically just a roof. This wasn't that uncommon, but major renovations happened right before the destruction. They enclosed the sanctuary area. It had Egyptian influences on how the sacred area was laid out in items that were found there. So some of the finds were 7 lampstands or 7 bowls. That was of a common motif. An amulet with hieroglyphics, ceramic pottery featuring Egyptian gods, and other Egyptian liturgical vessels. Also found was a small bronze figurine, which may have been a representation of the god Baal. Let's talk a little bit about Baal. And I mean, we could talk a lot about Baal, but here is a short discussion. He was a Canaanite Phoenician god, often set up as the baddie in the Old Testament, likely because Baal was a storm god and one of the many Canaanite gods who were in conflict with the Israelites, who worshipped a different storm god. And it's possible there's different texts that have been found. One called the Baal cycle. It could have been that the Israelites were worshiping Baal's son, Yahweh. There's so much more we could discuss about that, and we very well may in future episodes. Baal replaced El as the king of the gods, and El is one of the many names of the Israelite God, including Yahweh and Adonai. Much of the Baal-Yahweh conflict in the Bible may have come from the southern kingdom of Judah having conflict with the northern kingdom of Israel. Their religions may have been evolving in slightly different directions or paralleling each other, but having just some slightly different things going on. Think about the proximity of the kingdom of Israel to Phoenicia. Baal, also known as Bel, is pretty close to El, right? I mean, you can see a Baal, Bel, El, very similar. And there was lots of, in that day and age, a lot of opportunities for syncretization, differentiation, and divergence, and even convergence of belief. And not all of these things happening separately, all of them happening in different ways at different times in different aspects of the divergence, differentiation, syncretization, and convergence. We'll possibly get more into Baal in other episodes. I also have a wild theory that I think that there was some influence of Hittite Indo-European sky religion, and even coming from other groups, Indo-European groups such as the Mitanni into this area. But that's a whole different story, again, for a different day. But getting back to the Azekah temple, this temple is important because it sheds light on a very early time in southern Canaanite history. This is the time before the kingdoms of unified Israel was even a thing, let alone a kingdom of Judah. It opens up a lot of speculations about how people moved around this area and could even shed light on the Exodus and other descriptions from the Old Testament. I think it makes us ask questions about why the Temple of Solomon has much more connection to the temple architecture traditions to Syria in the north and Semitic traditions than to temple traditions of Egypt. Egypt had such strong connections to this area of Canaan and influenced Canaanite temples, but later temples, such as Solomon's temple, don't share those influences. There's so much more to think about this particular time period and geographical area. What makes it a great time period to think about is that so much was lost due to the Bronze Age collapse. The Bronze Age collapse is the thing that kind of overshadows all of this. What do you think? What are some of your speculations? I'd love to hear them. Thank you for supporting the History of the Papacy. A great way to support it is to go over to YouTube, like and subscribe to us there. Links are in the show notes. You can consider supporting us on Patreon at any level. Make a one-time donation on Patreon, make a one-time donation on PayPal. You can also, if there's another one of these sites, there's other sites, Buy Me a Coffee, etc. If you want me to get onto those, I would be happy to. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will talk to you next time.